November 1939. The temperature along the Karelian Isthmus had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and the ground had frozen hard enough to carry tanks. The lakes were solid. The spruce forests that covered most of southern Finland stood motionless in air so cold that the breath of a man condensed and froze on his scarf before it could dissipate. In the border towns along the Karelian Isthmus, families who had been told there might be war had not entirely believed it. The evacuation orders came before dawn. People left with what they could carry. Behind them, the sky to the southeast had been growing lighter for the wrong reasons. The Red Army of the Soviet Union, the largest military force in the world, crossed the Finnish border at 32 points simultaneously, with nearly 500,000 men, 4,000 tanks, and an air force that outnumbered Finland's by a factor of 30 to 1. The Soviet High Command had told its troops to pack light. The war would last 2 weeks at most. Helsinki would be taken. The Finnish workers, correctly understood as proletarians oppressed by a bourgeois state, would welcome liberation. Finland had a population of 3.7 million people, an army of roughly 300,000 men, 32 tanks, and no meaningful air force. The most senior Finnish military planner, looking at those numbers on paper, would have had no rational basis for confidence. What followed over the next 105 days became one of the most studied military campaigns of the 20th century, not because Finland won. It did not in any permanent sense, but because of what it revealed about what a small, well-led, highly motivated force fighting on its own terrain could do to a large and poorly organized one. The Red Army lost an estimated 125,000 dead. Finland lost around 25,000. The Soviet Union won the war. And Finland, in winning almost every battle, lost just enough to be forced into a peace that left a wound in the national memory that would not close. And that would, within 18 months, drive a small Nordic democracy into a military alliance with Adolf Hitler. That alliance is the thing that requires explanation. Finland was not a fascist state. It was a functioning parliamentary democracy with free elections, an independent judiciary, and a free press. Its people were, by and large, not sympathetic to Nazism. Its leadership was not ideologically aligned with Hitler's project in the way that, say, Hungary or Romania were aligned with it. There were Finnish fascists. A political movement called the Lapland War movement had been active in the early 1930s and had been suppressed by the government, but they were a fringe, and they did not drive the decision to align with Germany. The decision was driven by fear, by geography, and by a strategic calculation made under duress. And yet, from June 1941 until September 1944, 3 years and 3 months, Finland fought alongside Germany on the Eastern Front, its soldiers advancing into Soviet territory alongside Wehrmacht units, its air force operating in coordination with the Luftwaffe, its generals meeting with German counterparts to coordinate operations against a common enemy. The Nuremberg prosecutors looked at Finland's role in the war and chose not to include it in the indictment. The Allies looked at it and chose, eventually, to treat Finland differently from the other Axis partners. But the question remains uncomfortable, and it remains real. How did a democracy end up in a military alliance with the Third Reich? And what does the answer reveal about the limits of moral clarity when a country is fighting for its existence? To answer that question honestly, you have to go back further than November 1939. You have to go back to the winter of 1917, to the moment Finland became a country, and to the specific way it became one, because the origin of Finnish independence shaped the fears and the strategic calculus that drove every subsequent decision. Finland had been part of the Russian Empire since 1809, when the Tsar annexed it from Sweden. For a century, it had a degree of autonomy, its own parliament, its own laws, its own culture. But it was not independent, and the pressure toward Russification in the late 19th century had made the relationship increasingly bitter. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, the Finns saw their moment and declared independence in December of that year. What followed was not a peaceful transition. Within weeks of independence, Finland descended into a civil war between the Red Guards, Finnish workers aligned with the Bolshevik Revolution, and the White Guards, a bourgeois and conservative force backed by the German army, which sent troops and officers to help suppress the Finnish left. The civil war was brief but savage. The Whites won. Somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 Finns died, a large proportion of them Red prisoners who died in camps after the fighting ended, killed by hunger and disease, and, in some cases, execution. The wounds from that civil war, which ran along class lines and left deep bitterness on both sides, shaped Finnish political life for decades. But what it also did was establish in the minds of Finland's governing class a specific and enduring fear that the Soviet Union, which had supported the Red Guards and which continued to support Finnish communist movements afterward, was an existential threat, and that the threat was not abstract or distant. It was a neighbor with a border 30 kilometers from the second city of Finland. For the 2 decades between independence and the Winter War, Finnish foreign and defense policy was organized around that fear. Finland joined the League of Nations. It tried to build Nordic solidarity with its Scandinavian neighbors. It sought bilateral non-aggression agreements and maintained diplomatic relations with Moscow that were correct in form and deeply distrustful in substance. It maintained a policy of strict neutrality and tried to avoid provoking the Soviet Union while simultaneously building a military that was designed for one specific purpose: to make the cost of invading Finland high enough that the Soviets would think twice. The officer corps was trained by men who had studied in German and French military academies. The army's tactics and doctrine were developed with close attention to the specific terrain of Finland: the forests, the lakes, the winter, the absence of roads that mechanized armies needed. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, the former Tsarist general who had led the White forces in the Civil War and who remained the dominant figure in Finnish military planning through the interwar period, understood something that the Soviet planners apparently did not: that Finland's terrain was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a weapon to be used, and that an army trained to use it could multiply its effective strength by factors that no order of battle could capture. The Soviet demands that preceded the Winter War were, from Moscow's perspective, straightforward strategic logic. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer between Leningrad and the Finnish border. Leningrad was then the second city of the USSR, and its northern suburbs were within artillery range of Finnish territory. Stalin wanted Finland to cede the Karelian Isthmus and several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and to lease the Hanko Peninsula for a Soviet naval base. In exchange, the Soviet Union would offer Finland a larger slice of Soviet Karelia to the north, which happened to be sparsely populated and of limited strategic value. Finnish negotiators refused. Partly, this was national pride and the memory of what compromise had meant in the 19th century. Partly, it was a strategic calculation. If you cede the ground you have prepared your defenses on, you have no defenses. The Mannerheim line made sense precisely where it was. Moving it north would require rebuilding from nothing. The negotiations broke down in November 1939. The Soviet Union fabricated an incident, a shelling of Soviet territory that Finnish investigators found no evidence had occurred, and crossed the border. The Winter War lasted from November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940, and in those 105 days it accomplished several things simultaneously. It established Finnish military reputation as something extraordinary. The Finnish army fought a kind of war the Red Army had not prepared for and could not easily adapt to. Finnish soldiers moved on skis through terrain that swallowed Soviet armored columns whole. The great forests of the Karelian Isthmus, which the Soviet planners had not thought to take seriously as a tactical obstacle, became killing grounds. Soviet tank crews who abandoned their vehicles in the cold died within hours. Soviet infantry units that tried to advance down forest roads found themselves channeled into killing grounds by soldiers who materialized from the trees, fired, and disappeared before any coherent response was possible. The tactic called motti, encircling Soviet columns in the forest and then destroying them piecemeal, cutting supply lines, letting the cold do the work that Finnish ammunition could not afford to do, was improvised from necessity and executed with a skill that professional military observers across the world watched with something between admiration and disbelief. The Red Army's failures in the opening weeks of the Winter War were not merely tactical, they were systemic. Stalin's purges of the officer corps in 1937 and 1938 had removed approximately 35,000 officers, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders. What remained was a military that had its most experienced and independent-minded leaders dead or in the labor camps, replaced by men who had survived the purges partly by not standing out, partly by not making decisions that could be held against them, partly by conforming. The result was an army that could assemble enormous mass but could not coordinate it, that could issue orders but could not adapt when the orders encountered the actual ground, that could not improvise because improvisation required the kind of individual judgment that the purges had been designed to eliminate. Against a Finnish army that was almost entirely improvisation, small unit tactics, driven by sergeants and lieutenants who made decisions without waiting for orders, because waiting for orders in a Finnish winter was a good way to die. The Red Army's rigidity was not merely a handicap, it was a fatal vulnerability. At Suomussalmi, a Soviet division and a half, roughly 45,000 men, was encircled and destroyed by Finnish forces numbering fewer than 12,000. The bodies were found in the spring, still in their positions, frozen in the postures of men who had died of cold and hunger before the Finnish rifles found them. The international press covered these battles with something between awe and disbelief. Churchill, who was not yet Prime Minister but was First Lord of the Admiralty, called it proof that the Soviet army was not as formidable as had been believed. He was right about the immediate observation and wrong about the long-term implication. The Soviet army of 1944 would not be the Soviet army of 1940, and the lesson the Soviets drew from the Winter War was not that Finland could not be defeated, but that their own army needed to be rebuilt from the inside out. And yet, the Winter War also revealed the limits of Finnish resilience. The Red Army was learning. The purged officer corps was being replaced, imperfectly and painfully, by men who had survived and who were beginning to understand what had gone wrong. By February 1940, the Soviet command had assembled a force and a method that the Mannerheim line could not indefinitely resist. The assault that broke through the Finnish defenses on February 11th was different from the chaotic attacks of December and January. It was organized, it was sustained, it used artillery in the coordinated way that Soviet doctrine prescribed and that the early attacks had failed to apply. The Finnish line held for weeks after the breakthrough, fighting retreats that cost the Soviets dearly, but holding was not winning. Finland was running out of men, out of ammunition, out of the margin of error that had allowed it to absorb Soviet losses at ratios that any military planner would have called impossible. The peace of March 1940 was accepted because there was no alternative that did not mean the complete military collapse of Finland and occupation by a force that had demonstrated what it was willing to do to Finland's cities. The peace terms the Soviet Union imposed in March 1940 were harsher than its original demands. Finland lost the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, and the Hanko Peninsula. Approximately 400,000 Finns, more than 10% of the country's population, were evacuated from the ceded territories in a matter of weeks, carrying what they could, leaving behind farms and cities and graveyards and everything they had built across generations. The wound this created in Finnish society was not metaphorical. It was the loss of the second city of the country, of agricultural land that had fed a substantial portion of the population, of places where families had lived for 100 years. And the lesson that Finland's leadership drew from the Winter War was simple and terrifying. The Soviet Union would come again. It had not been satisfied by what it had taken. It was rebuilding its army, improving its tactics, and waiting for a better moment. When it came back, it would come with an army that had learned from its mistakes. Finland needed an ally, and it needed one that could actually deter or defeat the Soviet Union. In 1940, the list of candidates was very short. The German army had overrun France in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated operational capabilities that no other military in the world could match. And Germany was, by the summer of 1940, the dominant power in continental Europe, the only power that could plausibly serve as a counterweight to Soviet pressure on Finland. The Finns had not sought this alignment. They had spent the interwar period explicitly trying to maintain neutrality and distance from both great power blocs. But the Winter War had stripped away the illusions on which that neutrality rested. Neutrality required that both sides respect it. The Soviet Union had not respected it. And so Finnish military and political leaders began, in the months following the March 1940 armistice, to explore what kind of relationship might be possible with Germany. The exploration was cautious, and the relationship was never formalized in the way that, say, the Tripartite Pact formalized the Axis alliance. Finland never signed the Tripartite Pact. Finland never declared itself a member of the Axis. What Finland did was reach a series of practical military arrangements, transit agreements, intelligence sharing, operational coordination, that amounted, in practice, to co-belligerency without formal alliance. The transit agreement of September 1940 allowed German forces to pass through Finnish territory to resupply their garrison in occupied Norway. This was the first visible step toward what would follow, and it was deeply controversial within Finland at the time. It was defended as a practical necessity. Germany had the power to demand it. Refusal would have been costly, and the agreement bought time. It was also, plainly, a choice. Finland was not neutral in September 1940. It was tilting toward Germany, and the people who made that choice knew what they were tilting toward, even if they told themselves that the urgency of the Soviet threat justified it. What followed in June 1941 is the central event around which Finnish historical memory has been arguing ever since. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, sending 3.5 million men across the Soviet border on a front of nearly 3,000 kilometers. Finland had been informed of the operation in advance and had been involved in preliminary planning. German mountain troops had already moved through Finland to positions in Lapland, from which they would attack Soviet Murmansk and the Murmansk Railway, the rail line through which Allied supplies would eventually flow to the Soviet Union. Finnish forces began offensive operations on the Soviet border, not on the 22nd, but on the 25th of June, after Soviet air attacks on Finnish cities, attacks that the Finnish government used to argue, in its public communications, that Finland was responding to Soviet aggression rather than joining a German offensive. This framing became the foundation of the Finnish national narrative of the war. The continuation war, as Finns called it, was not participation in Germany's war. It was Finland's own separate war, fought for Finland's own separate objectives, which were the recovery of the territories lost in 1940 and the establishment of a more defensible border. The advance in the summer of 1941 was rapid and, for Finnish soldiers, emotionally charged in a way that the defensive Winter War had not been. They were crossing back into territory that had been taken from them 18 months earlier. They were passing through villages that their own families had left behind, finding intact houses and barns and churches and the accumulated material of a life that had been abandoned in February. There was a quality to this reconquest that was different from the mechanized advance of a German armored division. It was personal, it was specific. and it created a moral certainty that made the early months of the continuation war feel, to the soldiers fighting it, like straightforward justice. The difficulty came when the advance reached the old 1939 border and kept going. The argument was always that the pre-war border was indefensible, that Finland needed additional depth to prevent the next Soviet invasion from reaching the populated core of the country before Finnish forces could react. There was strategic logic in this argument, and there was also the logic of opportunity. German forces were advancing across the Soviet Union at a pace that suggested the war might end in German victory within months, and a Finland that advanced now could establish its desired border from a position of strength rather than negotiation. Finnish forces crossed the old border, pushed into Soviet Karelia beyond the pre-war Finnish boundary, and established a line that the Finnish government described as temporary and defensive, but that looked, from the outside, very much like an annexation. It was here that the separate war argument began to strain under its own weight, not because Finland was fighting for German objectives, but because the objectives Finland chose were taking it further into a war whose outcome it could not control and whose character it was not entirely driving. The argument has real substance and it has real limits. The real substance is this: Finnish objectives were genuinely different from German objectives. Finland was not trying to destroy the Soviet state. It was not participating in the Holocaust in the way that German allies on the Eastern Front participated in it, with one significant and deeply uncomfortable exception that will be addressed shortly. Finnish troops stopped their advance when they had recovered the lost territories and established what Mannerheim considered a defensible line. They did not press on toward Leningrad when the Germans expected them to. When the Germans asked Finnish forces to advance beyond the old 1939 border into Soviet territory proper, beyond what could be justified as reconquest, Mannerheim refused. He refused because he understood that a Finland that participated in the destruction of the Soviet state would be permanently dependent on Germany, and that permanent dependence on Germany was an outcome nearly as dangerous as permanent pressure from the Soviet Union. He was thinking 2 wars ahead, while Hitler was thinking about the current one. The real limits of the separate war argument are equally important. Finland's military operations in 1941 and 1942 were coordinated with German operations. German forces operated from Finnish territory. Finnish troops besieged Soviet Leningrad from the north, contributing to a siege that killed approximately 1 million Soviet civilians through starvation and bombardment, one of the deadliest sieges in military history. The siege lasted nearly 900 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, and the Finnish contribution to it, holding the northern arc of the encirclement, was not incidental. The city could not be fully supplied by land as long as Finnish forces held the Karelian Isthmus and the areas to the north. There was a supply route across Lake Ladoga, the road of life, which kept the city from complete starvation, but it was a thin and precarious line that operated under constant threat. The German and Finnish forces together created the encirclement that made the siege what it was. Whether removing Finland from the equation would have broken the siege entirely, or merely reduced its severity, or made no material difference because the Germans alone held enough of the perimeter to maintain the blockade. This is the question that historians cannot fully answer because the counterfactual cannot be run. What is not a counterfactual is the 1 million dead. What is not a counterfactual is that Finnish soldiers were part of the force that made that death toll possible. The distinction between co-belligerency and alliance, between Finland's war and Germany's war, was real at the strategic level and blurred at the operational level. Both things were true simultaneously. The Holocaust question is the most difficult part of the story, and it is the part that Finnish historical memory has been slowest to fully confront. Finland had approximately 2,000 Jewish citizens, most of them Finnish nationals whose families had been in the country for generations. They served in the Finnish army, fought in Finnish units, and were not persecuted in the systematic way that Jews in German-occupied territories were persecuted. The Finnish government refused German demands to hand over Finnish Jews for deportation, and the refusal was clear and consistent throughout the war. This is the part of the story that is often told. The part that is less often told involves a different category of people. In the autumn and winter of 1941, the Finnish security police, in coordination with the German SS, handed over to German forces a group of approximately 47 people, Soviet prisoners of war and refugees, most of them Jewish, who were living in Finland but who did not have Finnish citizenship. They were transferred to German custody in German-occupied territory. Virtually all of them were killed. The Finnish government's knowledge of what would happen to these people when they were transferred has been the subject of historical investigation. And the conclusion of the most careful recent scholarship is that Finnish officials knew, or should have known, what German custody in 1941 meant for Jewish prisoners. The transfers happened. The people died. The Finnish government's refusal to surrender Finnish Jews does not erase this, and Finnish historical memory has had to slowly and not always willingly make room for it. The turning point came at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 and 1943. The destruction of the German Sixth Army, the largest defeat in German military history, changed the strategic picture in a way that Finland could not ignore. Germany was not going to win the war. The question for Finnish leadership was no longer how to use the German alliance to achieve Finnish objectives, but how to exit the alliance before Germany's defeat became Finland's disaster. This was not a simple problem. Germany had troops in Finland, the German Army of Norway, which was operating on Finnish territory in the far north in Lapland. The Germans had supply lines running through Finland. The relationship was entangled in ways that could not be untangled overnight. And the Soviet Union, which was the party Finland needed to negotiate with, was in a position of growing strength and had no particular reason to offer generous terms. Finnish diplomacy through 1943 and into 1944 was conducted in the full awareness that Finland was losing its leverage with every month that the war continued. The Finns sent signals to Washington and Stockholm about their desire for a separate peace. They made contact with Soviet representatives through Swedish intermediaries. They watched the German position in Russia deteriorate and calculated that they had a narrowing window in which to exit the war before the Soviet Union felt strong enough to impose its preferred outcome without negotiation. The American government, which had been careful not to declare war on Finland despite Finland's co-belligerency with Germany, pressed the Finns to seek a separate peace. The British had declared war on Finland in December 1941 under pressure from Stalin, but had never fought Finland and were equally eager to see a negotiated exit. The Soviet offensive that began in June 1944 on the Karelian Isthmus was, in its initial phase, as overwhelming as the Winter War had been. The Red Army of 1944 was not the Red Army of 1939. It had learned from its catastrophic early failures. It had received enormous quantities of Allied equipment, American trucks, British tanks, communications gear that transformed the command and logistics of Soviet units at every level. It had a corps of experienced officers who had survived the purges and learned their trade in 4 years of brutal warfare against the best army in the world. The Soviet assault broke through the Finnish lines in the first days and advanced at a rate that the Winter War defenders would not have thought possible. The Finns fell back, fighting retreats that bought time but could not stop the advance. Viipuri fell again. The Finnish military was doing things right, executing controlled withdrawals, inflicting costs at every position, keeping its formations coherent, and none of it was enough to stop the momentum of an offensive that the Soviet command was driving with the resources of a superpower that knew it was winning the war. The question in June and July 1944 was not whether Finland could defeat the Soviet offensive, but whether it could hold long enough to negotiate before the Soviet Union decided that negotiation was unnecessary and total conquest was more efficient. The stabilization of the line in July 1944 was among the most consequential military achievements of the war's final year, and it happened because Finnish infantry, fighting in terrain it knew, armed at the last minute with German anti-tank weapons, held position after position against Soviet armored attacks that had overwhelmed every previous obstacle. The Finnish soldier of 1944 was a different soldier from the one of 1939. Older, more experienced, more tired, fighting with the specific exhaustion of men who have been at war for 4 years and who understand with great clarity what they are fighting to preserve. The line held. It was not the old line. It was a line drawn in blood and tactical improvisation, but it held long enough for the political process to catch up with the military one. It was in this moment of maximum pressure that Finland made its last and most compromising step toward Germany. President Risto Ryti, in a personal letter to Hitler, promised that Finland would not conclude a separate peace without German consent in exchange for German military aid, specifically a shipment of anti-tank weapons and air support that Finland desperately needed to stabilize its front. The Ryti-Ribbentrop Agreement, as it came to be called, was never ratified by the Finnish parliament. Ryti had made it as a personal commitment, calculating that he could resign the presidency when the moment for peace came, and that his successor would not be bound by a personal promise that had never had constitutional standing. It was a piece of constitutional manipulation in service of a strategic necessity, and it worked precisely as Ryti intended. The German aid arrived, the Finnish lines stabilized, the Soviet offensive, which had seemed capable of overrunning the country, was held. In August 1944, Risto Ryti resigned. Marshal Mannerheim, the 77-year-old commander who had led Finland through the Winter War and the Continuation War, was elected president by the Finnish parliament. His authority was, by that point, such that no German general or political leader could easily accuse him of bad faith. He began immediate peace negotiations with the Soviet Union. The terms the Soviets demanded were harsh but survivable. The borders of the March 1940 treaty, plus some additional concessions, plus reparations of $300 million, plus, and this was the clause that transformed the war's final phase, the requirement that Finland expel all German forces from its territory. The expulsion of the German army of Norway from Finnish Lapland became the Lapland War, and it lasted from September 1944 to April 1945. The Germans, who had been Finland's partners for 3 years, retreated northward and westward through Finnish Lapland in a systematic campaign of destruction that was among the most thorough the German military conducted anywhere in the war. They burned the city of Rovaniemi to the ground, a city of 15,000 people, the administrative capital of Finnish Lapland, reduced to rubble and ash so completely that its own engineers later admitted they had used the destruction of the city as a training exercise for demolitions troops. They burned villages, destroyed bridges, mined roads, felled trees across paths and tracks, blew up communications infrastructure, killed livestock, and left behind a landscape that looked, in the spring of 1945, like something from another century. Approximately 100,000 Finnish civilians were evacuated from Lapland during the fighting, most of them north to Sweden, and many of them returned to find nothing left, not their houses, not their barns, not the roads between them. The character of the Lapland War was unlike any other phase of Finland's involvement in the Second World War, and it created a kind of moral whiplash that Finnish soldiers found difficult to process. These were men who had fought alongside the German army for 3 years, men who had shared positions, shared supplies, in some cases shared meals and conversation and the specific camaraderie of soldiers in the same theatre. Now they were chasing those same men through a Finnish forest while the Germans burned everything they had formerly protected. The Finnish army conducted the Lapland War under political constraints that required it not to press the pursuit so hard that it provoked a German decision to turn and fight seriously, which meant, in practice, that Finnish forces advanced and the Germans retreated, and the destruction happened in the space between them, and there was often nothing the Finnish soldiers could do except watch the fires. The Germans got out. Lapland was destroyed in the process. The reconstruction took years. Some communities that had existed for generations were rebuilt from nothing. Some were not rebuilt at all. The war ended for Finland in April 1945 when the last German soldiers crossed into Norway. Finland had been at war, in one form or another, since November 1939. It had fought the Soviet Union twice, allied with Germany once, and fought Germany once, all within 6 years on the territory of a country with fewer people than Greater Stockholm. The human cost was approximately 94,000 dead, out of a population of 3.7 million, a proportion comparable to the losses of the major combatant nations. The material cost was enormous. The reparations alone required Finland to deliver goods equivalent to a significant fraction of its annual national product every year for 6 years, a burden that shaped the Finnish economy for a decade and that transformed Finnish industry in ways that were, eventually, more beneficial than harmful, as the forced industrialization to meet reparation demands built manufacturing capacity that Finland would have taken generations to develop otherwise. The territorial cost was the permanent loss of Karelia and the permanent displacement of the 400,000 people who had been evacuated from it in 1940 and who never returned. What Finland preserved, in the end, was its independence. It was the only country sharing a border with the Soviet Union that emerged from the Second World War with its sovereignty intact, its democratic institutions functioning, and its army still in the field. The Baltic states were incorporated into the Soviet Union. Poland became a satellite. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria became satellites. Finland became Finland, compromised, pressured, constrained in its foreign policy by a relationship with Moscow that would define Finnish diplomacy for the next 40 years, but sovereign, democratic, and free in a way that none of its comparable neighbors were. The question of how to evaluate the choices that produced that outcome has occupied Finnish historians and Finnish public life ever since. The prosecution at Nuremberg considered the question and decided not to pursue it, a decision that reflected both the Allied government's interest in maintaining a functional Finland as a buffer state between the Soviet Union and Scandinavia, and a genuine ambiguity about whether Finland's actions rose to the level of crimes against peace under the definitions the tribunal was applying. Finland was co-belligerent, not a formal Axis member. It had never signed the tripartite pact. Its objectives were territorial and defensive rather than ideological and expansionist. The legal questions were genuinely difficult, and the political questions were equally so. The Allied governments had spent the war carefully maintaining their relationship with Finland. The United States never declared war on Finland. Britain did so only under Soviet pressure and with obvious reluctance, because they wanted a Finland that survived the war with its institutions intact and its democratic character preserved. That preference shaped the post-war settlement. The Finnish war responsibility. Trials of 1945 and 1946 were domestic proceedings in which the leaders who had made the decisions to enter the continuation war were tried under retroactive Finnish law, a legally awkward process that convicted 8 men, including former President Ryti, and that was widely seen within Finland as a performance required by the armistice terms rather than a genuine reckoning. Ryti served less than 2 years before being released on health grounds. Mannerheim, who as president had accepted the armistice terms and who had organized the entire continuation war strategy, was never tried. His role was considered too central to Finnish national identity and too complicated to be addressed through a legal process without tearing the country apart. He died in Switzerland in 1951, in exile of a kind, having outlived the war and its most immediate consequences, but not the debates his decisions had set in motion. The genuine reckoning has been slower and more painful and is, in some respects, still incomplete. The recovery of Karelia has remained a periodic political question in Finland, debated with varying intensity as the Soviet Union became Russia and Russia's internal politics shifted. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, there was a moment when some Finnish politicians raised the Karelia question openly. The Russian government made clear it was not interested, and the Finnish government concluded that the relationship with Russia and the stability of the current border were more important than the symbolic return of territory whose population had been Finnish 60 years ago. The question of Finnish responsibility for the Leningrad siege has been addressed honestly by some historians and defensively by others. The question of the 47 Jewish prisoners transferred to German custody has been the subject of a thorough government-commissioned investigation that confirmed the transfers and their fatal consequences, and that represented a significant moment of national self-examination. Each of these reckonings has required Finland to hold simultaneously the truth of its extreme strategic circumstances and the truth that circumstances do not fully excuse everything done within them. The story of Finland in the Second World War is, in the end, a story about what countries do when they have no good options, when every available choice involves a compromise of principle or a risk of annihilation, and when the luxury of moral clarity is simply not available. Finland chose the alliance with Germany because it feared the Soviet Union more, because Germany appeared to be winning, and because the alternative, neutrality or accommodation with Moscow, seemed to lead directly to the absorption that had already consumed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those were not irrational calculations. They were not, in the circumstances of 1941, obviously wrong. They were also not without moral cost, and the moral cost was paid not only by Finland, but by people who had no voice in the decision. Mannerheim, who navigated the whole sequence, the Winter War, the Continuation War, the Lapland War, and who died in 1951, having preserved the country he had served for more than 40 years, is the figure around whom Finnish historical memory organizes itself, and the argument about him encapsulates the argument about Finland. He was a conservative aristocrat with complicated views on democracy, a former Tsarist officer who had fought for Finland's independence and then led the white side in its civil war, a man who had seen and done things that simple moral accounting does not accommodate easily. He made decisions that cost lives, Finnish lives, Soviet lives, and the lives of people who were handed over to killers. He also preserved a democracy in a neighborhood where democracies did not survive. Whether the preservation justifies the means, whether the means were more or less constrained than later memory has suggested, whether there were paths not taken that would have led to better outcomes? These are questions that Finns have been arguing about for 8 decades and that are unlikely to be settled by any one account. The borders that Finland negotiated in 1944 are, broadly, the borders that exist today. The Karelian Isthmus is Russian territory. Viipuri is Vyborg, a Russian city. The 400,000 evacuees built new lives in other parts of Finland, and their children and grandchildren carry the memory of a place they have never seen. The Finnish military, shaped by the experience of 2 wars against the Soviet Union, remained among the most capable defensive forces in Europe relative to the size of the country, a legacy of the Winter War's lessons that Finland never forgot. The foreign policy doctrine that Finnish leaders developed in the post-war decades, careful, pragmatic, maintaining correct relations with Moscow while keeping Western connections alive, kept the country free through the Cold War and positioned it to expand those Western connections when the Cold War ended. Finland joined NATO in April 2023, more than 80 years after the Winter War began. The application had been submitted the previous year, within weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and it passed through the alliance's ratification process with unusual speed, reflecting both the urgency of the moment and the quality of the candidate. Finland brought to NATO a military that was, by most assessments, the most capable defensive force in Europe relative to its size. The legacy of a country that had never stopped training for the war it hoped would not come, that had maintained universal male conscription through the post-war decades when most Western countries had moved to volunteer armies, that had kept its reserves ready and its equipment modern and its tactical doctrine sharp through 75 years of peace. The Finnish soldier of 2023 was the inheritor of something that went all the way back to the Winter War and to the specific lesson that Finland had paid in blood to learn. That geography and training and motivation, combined with the right weapons, could offset an enormous disparity in raw numbers. But that motivation and training were not enough if the enemy had allies and you did not. It was, for many Finns, the completion of the journey that started when the Soviet Union crossed the border in November 1939. The strategic judgment of 1939 that Finland needed allies that could actually deter Russian power had not changed. The available allies had. The alliance with Germany had been a desperate expedient that cost Finland 3 years of moral compromise, 94,000 dead, and a peace that left Karelia permanently on the other side of the border. The alliance with NATO was something different. A community of democracies entered freely without the pressure of an immediate invasion in the full light of public deliberation and parliamentary vote. The road between those two alliances ran through the Winter War, the Continuation War, the Lapland War, the Cold War, and 80 years of a small country working out, generation by generation, what it meant to be free in a dangerous neighborhood. If this story stayed with you, I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Finland's decision to ally with Nazi Germany is one of the most genuinely difficult moral and strategic questions of the Second World War. Historians still argue about whether it was a necessary compromise forced by impossible circumstances or a choice with alternatives that were not fully explored. So I will put the question to you directly. Was Finland's alliance with Germany a strategic necessity that preserved a democracy when every neighboring democracy was destroyed? Or was it a compromise that went further than the circumstances required, and that carried a moral cost that Finnish memory has been too slow to fully acknowledge? Tell me where you land, and tell me why. I read every comment, and on this one, I genuinely want to know what you think. Subscribe for the next chapter in the history of the war in Northern Europe. If this video found you, leave a like so it finds the next person too. Now watch this next one.